Late-night elevator rides. Quiet office buildings. A sense of being watched, a breath in the air. What starts as a mundane, ordinary journey can quickly turn into a nightmare. Mark, Claire, Tom, and Sarah, each of them, late, exhausted, seeking only to go home, find themselves trapped in elevators where time seems to stretch and reality begins to warp. The walls press in, the lights flicker, and someone unseen begins to close in on them. These aren't just mechanical failures, they're more than that. Something darker lurks in the spaces between floors. And it's watching. Waiting. The elevator doors slid shut with a soft ding, sealing the small, claustrophobic space that was supposed to carry him up just a few floors. As the smooth hum of the machinery kicked in, Mark let out a deep, exhausted sigh. Another day, another ride. He wasn't particularly tired, just drained from the week. It had been a long, uneventful Wednesday. A typical workday. Nothing that stood out in the least. But that's what made it odd. The day was so ordinary, so devoid of anything out of the usual. Maybe that's what made this ride different, this elevator ride feel different. Mark glanced at the time on his phone. It was nearly 8 p.m., too late for most of the office workers to still be around. Yet here he was, on his way to the top floor where his car was parked in the dimly lit garage. The building had been quiet all day, as if it was tired. The air was thick with that musty scent of old carpet, and the walls reflected the pale light in the same boring beige that filled every corporate building. It was the kind of place that swallowed any sense of personality or warmth, and today, for some reason, Mark felt the weight of that. The cold metallic walls, the sterile flickering lights. It all seemed to press in on him. He pressed the button for the top floor, his thumb lingering a little longer than necessary. There was something strangely comforting about the quiet as the elevator started its ascent. His reflection in the mirrored doors was faint but present, blending in with the shadows that stretched across the steel. He tried to ignore the strange, unsettling feeling tugging at his gut, the odd sense that something just wasn't right. Maybe it was the way the elevator seemed to close in on him. Or maybe it was the way the lights flickered just for a second, the sudden coldness that brushed against his skin. For a split second, Mark wondered if it was just the tiredness setting in. He blinked and rubbed his eyes. As the elevator glided upward, Mark tried to shake off the unease, but his mind couldn't help but wander. He'd been coming to this building for years, and never once had something felt out of place. Yet today, he couldn't escape that gnawing feeling in his stomach. The elevator hummed with a mechanical precision, but even the sound seemed wrong. It wasn't a comforting whir that usually came with a smooth elevator ride. This one felt different. It was as though the elevator itself was breathing, slow, methodical, mechanical, and somehow alive. The lights flickered again, longer this time. Mark tensed. He checked his phone again. Everything looked normal. Nothing seemed out of place, but the atmosphere in the car had shifted. The faint smell of something metallic lingered in the air now. A smell that he couldn't quite place. His heartbeat picked up a little, and for a brief moment he wondered if he was just overthinking it. The elevator's smooth hum slowed, and the lights flickered once again, this time with a little more force. Mark felt a shiver crawl down his spine. A sudden jolt sent his body jerking forward, and the elevator shuddered, the cable straining with a sound too deep to ignore. Mark's stomach churned, and he instinctively pressed the emergency stop button, though his hand trembled slightly. The elevator didn't stop. It didn't even acknowledge his input. That's when he heard it. A faint rustling behind him, just barely audible over the hum of the elevator. Mark spun around, his breath catching in his throat. The mirrored walls seemed to warp before his eyes. His reflection was still there. But there was something off about it. Something just not right. Mark's pulse quickened as his gaze flickered between the reflection and the empty car. He couldn't shake the feeling that someone else was there with him, hidden just outside the corner of his peripheral vision. His mind began to race. Could it be someone else in the building? It was late, so it seemed unlikely, but then again, maybe a janitor or maintenance worker had come on late. He shook his head. No, it wasn't that simple. Then he saw it, or thought he saw it. In the reflection. A figure. A tall, slender silhouette that wasn't there a moment ago. Mark's heart skipped a beat as his eyes locked onto the image of the figure standing just behind him, like a shadow trying to remain unnoticed. It wasn't clear at first, but as the seconds stretched on, the shape became clearer, taller, leaner, almost like it was moving with the elevator but not quite. He whipped around to face the back of the car. Empty. The space was entirely vacant. The elevator was still. Mark's breath hitched. It didn't make sense. He turned back to the mirror again. The figure was still there. It was almost like it had been waiting, standing just behind him. His heart raced. He wasn't sure if he was seeing things, but this was no longer just a creepy feeling. This was something far worse. Something palpable. Suddenly, the elevator jerked again, and Mark staggered backward, his hand gripping the railing. The figure was gone. The elevator was still. Mark exhaled slowly, but the knot in his chest tightened. The elevator hummed on. His hands still gripped the railing, his knuckles white. He felt like his brain couldn't quite process what had just happened. Maybe he was just exhausted. Maybe it was a trick of the light. But deep down, Mark knew that wasn't it. The thing in the reflection, the feeling of being watched, was too real. The doors slid open on the next floor with a sharp ding, and for the first time, Mark felt relieved. Maybe the feeling would fade once he stepped off. He glanced at the hallway just outside the elevator, empty and quiet. But as the doors closed again, a wave of dizziness overcame him, his stomach turning. The faint sound of breathing came from behind him, and this time, it wasn't just in his head. Mark spun around, his body moving faster than his mind. His reflection was there again, but it was no longer just his own face staring back at him. In the glass, there was another, faint at first, but becoming clearer by the second. The face wasn't his. It was pale, empty. Hollow eyes stared back at him from the reflection. It was a woman. Her face was gaunt, skin drawn tight over her skull. Her hair was matted with what looked like dark wetness. She looked directly at Mark with an intensity that made his stomach drop. No, no, no. Mark thought, trying to breathe, trying to step away. The doors were locked. He tried frantically pressing the button for the next floor, but it didn't respond. The elevator wasn't going to stop. Not now. The woman's lips curled into a grin, and that's when Mark heard her voice. Get out. The words were not spoken audibly, but inside his mind. The voice was a soft, almost breathless whisper that reverberated in his skull. Mark could feel his breath catch in his throat, his limbs frozen with a primal terror. He felt as if the air around him had thickened, like the oxygen had suddenly been drained from the small space. The woman's reflection continued to stare at him, her lips parting as though she was about to speak again, but the elevator suddenly lurched to a stop. The harsh ding sounded again, but this time it felt ominous. The doors slid open to reveal nothing but darkness. A heavy, oppressive silence stretched out from beyond the elevator. Mark felt a cold gust of wind. It wasn't coming from the elevator. No, this wind came from beyond. The darkness beyond the doors. A cold that made his bones ache. He was no longer alone. Claire stood in the lobby of the old office building, her fingers tapping nervously against the strap of her purse. The building was eerily quiet, with the only sound being the distant hum of a flickering light overhead. It was late, far later than she had planned to be there, but the project deadlines had piled up, and she had no choice but to stay until everything was finished. It had been a long, grueling day, and the exhaustion was beginning to weigh heavily on her. She glanced around the empty lobby. The air felt thick, stifling, like it was holding its breath. The lights flickered again, and Claire shook her head, trying to dismiss the unsettling feeling crawling up her spine. She had been here countless times before. This was her office building after all, but tonight, it felt different. She pressed the button for the elevator, the soft ding echoing in the empty space as the door slid open before her. She stepped inside, the cool metal walls surrounding her as she pressed the button for the top floor, where her car was parked in the near-empty garage. As the doors closed with a soft, familiar whoosh, she let out a sigh of relief. At least she could finally go home. The elevator was old, clunky, with a brass interior that had once been polished but now showed signs of age and neglect. The soft hum of the machinery filled the small, cramped space, and Claire closed her eyes for a moment, trying to relax. But it was hard to shake the feeling that something was wrong. She tried to ignore it, but the air in the elevator seemed heavier than usual, almost oppressive. A deep breath in, and she could smell the faint scent of dust, metal, and something she couldn't quite place, something old. The sensation of being watched crept up on her, but she dismissed it as nothing more than the tiredness that was clouding her mind. The elevator jerked, and Claire's body tensed involuntarily, gripping the railings on either side of her. She opened her eyes, staring at the digital display showing her progress, stopping at floor after floor. It was an odd thing, that moment of disorientation, like something was out of sync. The sound of the elevator's motor seemed too loud, too jarring, as though the building itself was straining to move her up. A strange metallic smell filled the air again. Claire's stomach twisted uneasily. She glanced at the mirrored wall opposite her. Her reflection was faint at first, but as her eyes focused, she noticed something. The reflection wasn't quite the same as the real thing. For a moment, she thought it was just her exhaustion playing tricks on her, but the more she looked, the more she became convinced something wasn't right. The reflection seemed off. The way the light flickered in the mirror, casting shadows in places they shouldn't be, it felt like someone else was standing there with her. Her heart skipped a beat. She forced herself to look away, to focus on the calm, sterile digits of the elevator's display. She took a slow, deep breath to steady herself. Maybe it was just the dim lighting playing tricks on her eyes. Or perhaps it was the anxiety creeping in. The day had been long after all. Just a little longer, and she'd be at the garage, where she could leave and forget all of this. The elevator suddenly lurched again, this time more violently. Claire's body shot forward, and her hand flew to the buttons, desperately pressing them as though it might fix the sudden jolt. The metal walls of the elevator creaked under the pressure, and Claire's stomach twisted in fear. She hadn't expected the ride to be this rough. Hadn't the elevator been serviced recently? Was there something wrong with the cables? But the thought felt too far-fetched, too rational for the fear that gripped her. The lights flickered, casting the elevator in eerie, ghostly shadows. Her reflection in the mirror seemed to distort again, as if the very air around her was shifting. She couldn't explain it, but there was a strange weight to the space, a presence that seemed to be closing in. It was as though the elevator had become something else, something darker. And then it happened. The lights went out. Total darkness. The sudden absence of light seemed to stretch time, making the space feel suffocating, as though the very walls of the elevator were pressing in on her. Claire's breath hitched, panic surging in her chest. The hum of the elevator's motor was gone, replaced by a heavy, oppressive silence. She couldn't hear the sound of the elevator moving anymore. It was as if the entire world outside had disappeared, leaving her alone in this tiny, claustrophobic space. She fumbled for her phone in the dark, her fingers shaking as she tried to turn on the flashlight. But the screen remained black. Her heart pounded in her chest as the reality of the situation set in. She was completely alone. The elevator had stopped, and the building outside seemed completely silent. No voices. No footsteps. Just the eerie quiet, as if the entire world had held its breath and forgotten to exhale. Claire's mind raced, her hands trembling as she pressed the buttons again and again, but the elevator didn't respond. The silence seemed to grow louder with each passing second. A sense of dread settled in the pit of her stomach. Her thoughts spun wildly, trying to find a logical explanation. Maybe it was just a power outage. Maybe the elevator had malfunctioned. But nothing felt right. The air inside the elevator felt cold, and her breath came out in soft puffs of mist, like a chill was creeping in from the walls themselves. Then the doors opened. At first, Claire thought it was just a glitch, that the elevator had reached the top floor. She squinted into the darkness outside, expecting to see the empty garage. But instead, what she saw made her heart stop. The hallway beyond the elevator was unfamiliar, empty, dark, and decaying. The walls were lined with peeling paint, and the air smelled damp, like the inside of an abandoned house. The faint smell of mildew filled her nose, and for a moment, she couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Her heart thudded in her chest, and every instinct told her to turn and run. But she couldn't. She stood frozen in place, staring at the strange, abandoned hallway that had appeared in front of her. The elevator was still, motionless, silent. But the hallway beyond seemed alive, almost breathing. She felt as though something was watching her from the shadows just beyond the light's reach, waiting for her to step out. Her breath quickened, her chest tight with fear. Then she saw it. A figure. Standing at the far end of the hallway. It was a woman, pale, gaunt, her hair hanging loosely in tangled strands around her face. Her eyes were dark, hollow, and she was staring straight at Claire, as though waiting for something. Waiting for Claire to make a move. Claire's breath caught in her throat. Every muscle in her body screamed at her to run, to get out of the elevator, but her legs wouldn't obey. She was frozen in place, rooted to the floor by the weight of the woman's gaze. It felt like time had stopped, like nothing else in the world mattered except that terrifying, hollow stare. And then, in the silence that stretched on for what felt like an eternity, the woman smiled. It wasn't a warm, welcoming smile. It was something else, something twisted, something cold and empty. A smile that made Claire's skin crawl. The woman's lips barely moved as she whispered something, but the words were distorted, muffled by the distance. Claire couldn't hear them clearly. But she didn't need to. She could feel the meaning of those words deep in her bones. Come closer. The whisper came again, louder this time, as if the woman was right beside her. Claire's heart raced. Every instinct told her to turn and run, but her legs were still frozen, her mind still struggling to comprehend what she was seeing. The woman's grin widened, and her eyes glowed with a sickening intensity. Claire's world narrowed to that single, terrifying moment. The woman's hollow stare. The dark hallway. The elevator that refused to move. And then, with a sickening lurch, the doors slammed shut. The elevator jerked into motion again, and Claire stumbled back, clutching the rails to steady herself. Her breath came in short gasps, and her heart pounded in her chest. She tried to force herself to calm down, to tell herself that it had been a hallucination, a trick of the mind brought on by exhaustion and fear. But deep down, she knew it wasn't. Whatever had just happened, whatever she had seen, it was real. And it wasn't over. Tom leaned against the cool metal of the elevator's wall, his fingers nervously tapping on the button panel as the car ascended. It had been a long day. A stressful one. He had stayed late at the library, buried in research, losing track of time until it was far too late to head home without taking a ride up to his apartment. He was used to the late-night hours. The building always felt emptier and quieter at this time of night, the silence heavier, more oppressive. It was a strange sensation, but he had grown accustomed to it. Or at least, he thought he had. As the elevator glided upward, Tom absent-mindedly checked his watch. It was just past midnight. The city outside was dark, the streets still and empty. He glanced at the display above the door, counting the floors as they passed, but his thoughts drifted. He had been living in this old building for nearly 2 years now, but there were still things about it that unsettled him. The way the floorboards creaked in the hallways, the strange, cold drafts that seemed to appear out of nowhere. It was the kind of place that always felt like something was off, though it was never obvious enough to explain why. The elevator gave a slight shudder, and Tom's hand instinctively gripped the rail. He shook his head, trying to focus. He was just tired. That was all. Tired from the long hours of study. It wasn't unusual for the building to make strange noises. Old buildings always did. But there was something about tonight, something about the way the air in the elevator felt different, that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. Maybe it was the fact that the building seemed so empty, so silent. Maybe it was the fact that he was alone, isolated in the small space. Another floor passed, but the elevator didn't stop. Tom frowned, glancing at the display again. He had pressed the button for his floor, floor 9, but the elevator had skipped it. It was a minor thing, a glitch, but something about it bothered him. He pressed the button again, more forcefully this time, as though that would make the elevator respond. There was a soft ding, and the elevator began to slow, but instead of stopping at his floor, it continued past it, the numbers on the display ticking upward. Tom frowned, his discomfort growing. The car didn't stop at the 10th floor either, or the 11th. Now it was heading toward the top. Something was wrong. This wasn't normal. He reached for the emergency stop button, but before his fingers could make contact, the elevator gave another lurch. This time, the motion was far more violent, and Tom stumbled against the wall, his heart racing. The lights flickered above him, casting long, distorted shadows along the elevator's walls. He gripped the metal bar, steadying himself, but his mind was racing. Why wasn't it stopping? What was going on? Then the air shifted. It was subtle at first, just a hint of something cold, a draft where there hadn't been one before. He inhaled sharply, his senses sharpening. The smell, faint but unmistakable, filled his nostrils. It was musty, like mold, mixed with something old and decayed. It was the kind of scent you would associate with an abandoned building or a forgotten basement, something that hadn't been touched in years. It was wrong, and the more Tom tried to ignore it, the more it clawed at him. The elevator jerked again, this time coming to a complete stop. Tom felt his heart skip a beat as the lights flickered one last time before dimming to a low, sickly glow. The sound of the elevator's machinery, which had been a constant hum, abruptly stopped, leaving behind a deafening silence. He swallowed hard, trying to steady his breathing. He glanced at the emergency button again, but the panic rising in his chest made his fingers tremble as he reached for it. Nothing happened. No familiar click of the button, no response at all. A sudden sound broke through the silence, a soft shuffle, followed by a faint scraping noise. It came from somewhere in the corner of the elevator. Tom's pulse quickened, his mind racing as he slowly turned his head toward the corner where the sound had originated. At first, there was nothing there. Just the empty, oppressive space of the elevator, the flickering lights casting eerie shadows. But as his eyes adjusted to the dim light, he thought he saw something shift, a shape, dark and indistinct, lurking just beyond the edge of his vision. His heart pounded in his chest as he blinked, trying to clear the fog in his mind. He stared at the corner, unable to look away, the sensation of being watched creeping up his spine. He had to be imagining things. It was the exhaustion, the stress, the late hour. There was no one in the elevator with him. Then the shape moved. It wasn't much, just a slight movement, something in the corner that hadn't been there a second ago. But it was enough to send a chill of fear running through Tom's body. His breath caught in his throat, and he froze, eyes wide, heart hammering in his chest. The shape, whatever it was, seemed to be growing, stretching, slowly taking form out of the shadows. He turned toward the door, his mind urging him to escape, but before he could make any move, the elevator jerked again, this time pulling downward. His stomach lurched in response, and he gripped the railing tighter, struggling to keep his balance. The scraping sound came again, closer this time. Louder. More persistent. Tom turned toward the sound, his eyes wide with terror. The shape was clearer now, more defined. It was a figure, a shadowy, indistinct mass that seemed to flicker in and out of focus. He couldn't make out any distinct features, but he could feel its presence, heavy and suffocating, like a cold weight pressing down on him. It moved again, closer this time, shifting across the floor of the elevator. Tom's heart raced, his panic intensifying. He had to get out. He had to. The lights flickered once more, casting everything in an unnatural, sickly glow. For just a moment, Tom saw the figure clearly in the dim light. A face, pale and twisted, with hollow eyes that seemed to bore into him, empty and soulless. A smile, stretched too wide, too unnatural, twisted the face into something monstrous. Tom's breath caught in his throat, and his body went cold with terror. He couldn't move. His legs wouldn't obey him. The figure stood there, just a few feet away from him now, watching him with those hollow eyes, its grin widening. And then the voice. It was a whisper at first, so faint Tom wasn't sure he had heard it. But then it came again, louder this time, the voice a raspy, hoarse whisper that seemed to crawl under his skin, making his blood run cold. Get out. The words weren't spoken aloud. They weren't words at all. They were thoughts, pressing into his mind, invading his brain. He could feel the command deep inside him, as though the voice was not just asking but demanding that he obey. Tom's legs shook, his body frozen in terror. He had to leave. He had to move. But he couldn't. He couldn't tear his eyes away from the figure, from the smile that stretched wider with each passing second. The lights flickered once more, and then everything went dark. Complete, utter darkness. Tom's heart pounded in his chest, his breathing shallow as he stumbled backward, reaching for the railing to steady himself. The silence was deafening, suffocating. He couldn't see, couldn't hear. The air felt thick and heavy, like something was pressing down on him, closing in from all sides. And then the voice came again. Louder, sharper. Get out. The elevator dropped suddenly, violently, like the cables had snapped, sending Tom's body jerking upward. His head slammed against the metal walls, and everything went black. When he opened his eyes again, the elevator was moving once more, smoothly this time. The lights were on again, and everything looked normal, as if nothing had happened. His head throbbed with pain, his pulse still racing as he struggled to sit up, dazed and confused. He stared at the mirrored walls, his reflection looking back at him, but it wasn't just his reflection anymore. There, in the mirror, was the figure. Watching. Waiting. With that same twisted smile. Sarah had never liked staying late at the old hotel, but tonight, there was no other option. She had stayed on the last shift, working on the final paperwork, her eyes growing heavier with every passing minute. The day had been long, and the sense of exhaustion that clung to her bones made the air in the building feel even colder. The hotel, despite its elegance and luxury, had a strange vibe at night, like it was holding on to some ancient secret that no one dared uncover. The creaking floorboards, the flickering lights, the way the walls seemed to groan under the weight of time, it all made Sarah uneasy. She tried to push the discomfort aside, telling herself that she was being silly. After all, this was just another late-night shift. The hotel was old, yes, but it was beautiful. Historic. It had its quirks, just like any other place, and yet Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to it. The elevator was an old-fashioned one, wood-paneled, ornate, with brass railings and a heavy, thick door that slid open with a soft whoosh. Sarah stepped inside, pressing the button for the top floor, her tired eyes glancing at the digital display as the elevator began its ascent. As the doors closed with a soft click, she let out a quiet sigh. At this hour, the hotel was nearly empty. The lobby was deserted, the hallways dark and silent except for the echo of her footsteps. The elevator moved smoothly, almost too smoothly, as if it had a mind of its own, as though the entire building was operating under its own set of rules. Sarah's skin prickled as she glanced at the brass mirror across from her. Her reflection looked tired, drained from the long hours of work, and yet something about the image didn't sit right with her. She thought she saw something in the reflection, a shadow that wasn't hers, a flicker of movement that didn't belong. She blinked and looked away, shaking her head to clear the strange thoughts from her mind. The elevator was just an elevator, nothing more. But the longer she stood there, the more the feeling of being watched pressed down on her. It was subtle at first, a sense that there was someone, or something, just behind her, waiting for her to turn around. She gripped the railings tighter, trying to dismiss the unease that had settled deep in her stomach. The elevator began to slow as it reached the higher floors, but instead of stopping at the top, it continued past Sarah's floor. She frowned, her heart rate picking up a little. She pressed the button for her floor again, but nothing happened. The elevator didn't respond. Sarah's stomach twisted with unease. The building was old, and sometimes the elevator acted up, but it wasn't like this. The car continued to ascend, its motion steady and deliberate, as if it had some predetermined destination that wasn't hers. Her fingers tightened around the railing as she looked at the digital numbers above the door, watching as the elevator continued its climb, floor after floor, with no sign of stopping. The ding that usually marked each floor's passage didn't sound. It was as if time itself had slowed, the elevator a vessel stuck in an endless loop. As the elevator moved higher, the atmosphere inside changed. The air grew heavier, colder. A faint smell of mildew began to creep in, filling her nostrils with a musty, stale odor that seemed to come from nowhere. Sarah wrinkled her nose, trying to focus on the building's smooth, polished interior, but the discomfort in her chest grew. The old brass paneling gleamed faintly in the dim light, and the soft click of the elevator's machinery seemed out of place in the stillness. She pressed the emergency stop button again, this time with more force, her pulse quickening, but nothing happened. The elevator didn't respond. Instead, it gave a strange lurch, a sudden shift that made Sarah's heart leap into her throat. The car jerked violently, throwing her off balance. She stumbled against the wall, clutching the railing for support. She could feel her pulse pounding in her neck, the rising sense of panic settling in. The elevator wasn't just malfunctioning, it was trapped, and so was she. The flickering light above her dimmed again, casting everything into a murky glow. Sarah swallowed hard, her chest tight. The sound of the elevator's mechanism groaned under the pressure, as if it were struggling to function. The air felt thick, suffocating, like it was filled with something she couldn't see but could feel deep in her bones. As she steadied herself, the strange odor grew stronger, more pungent. It was the smell of dampness, old wood, and something rotten. Something was wrong. She could feel it in every fiber of her being. The elevator slowed once more, but it didn't stop. Instead, it seemed to linger between floors, hovering in some empty space outside of time. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it lurched again. This time, it dropped, pulling Sarah's stomach into her throat. Her feet slipped on the smooth metal floor as the elevator plummeted downward, her breath catching in her throat. The walls around her seemed to close in, the space shrinking, the pressure increasing. She reached for the buttons again, but her fingers felt numb as the elevator continued its descent. The lights flickered one more time, and the entire car seemed to shudder in protest. For a moment, Sarah thought she heard a voice, faint, muffled, but unmistakable. It came from somewhere beyond the elevator, from the depths of the hotel. A whisper, soft and distant, like the rustling of paper, but it sounded almost like a child's voice. The elevator came to a screeching halt. The sudden stop jarred Sarah, throwing her off balance. She stumbled forward, catching herself against the wall. The metallic walls of the elevator were now eerily quiet, no sound from the machinery, no hum of the engine. Just silence. But it wasn't a comforting silence. It was a suffocating one. The kind of silence that stretched on too long, like it was holding its breath. The doors to the elevator creaked open slowly, inch by inch, and Sarah felt a cold chill crawl up her spine. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the door button, but something compelled her to step out. It was like a force, something inside her, something ancient, pulling her into the unknown. She took a cautious step forward, her breath shallow, the cold air seeping into her skin. The hallway outside was dark, shrouded in shadow. The dim light from the elevator barely illuminated the space beyond. The walls were old, cracked, peeling. Everything looked abandoned, forgotten. This wasn't the top floor. It wasn't even close. This wasn't the hotel she knew. The faint smell of decay filled her nose again. It was stronger now, thick and heavy. The air was damp, and the floor was covered in a thin layer of dust. The hallway stretched out before her, but there was no sound, no footsteps, no voices, no hum of the air conditioning, nothing. Just the oppressive silence that seemed to press in from all sides. As she stepped out of the elevator, Sarah noticed something that made her heart skip a beat. The hallway wasn't just abandoned. It was old. Very old. The floorboards creaked under her weight, but the pattern of the wood was different, decayed, warped, and weathered. The walls, once decorated with expensive wallpaper, were now peeling and discolored, as though the very building was aging before her eyes. And the air, thick with mildew, seemed to cling to her skin. It was as though this part of the hotel had been locked away for years, forgotten by time itself. She stepped forward, her steps slow, deliberate. Her body felt heavy, like the air was thicker here, like each movement was more labored. And then she heard it, the faintest rustle of something moving behind her. She froze, her heart racing in her chest. She turned slowly, scanning the elevator. But it was empty. Nothing was there. Yet the feeling of being watched didn't go away. It intensified. She could feel it in the pit of her stomach, the cold weight of 1,000 eyes on her. The air seemed to grow colder, and her breath came out in misty clouds. The whispering began again, barely audible but unmistakable. It came from the far end of the hallway, a faint voice, distant, calling her name. Sarah. The voice was low, soft, but it was unmistakable. Sarah's blood ran cold. She turned back to the elevator, but the doors had closed. The elevator had vanished, leaving her alone in this strange, forgotten part of the hotel. She couldn't remember how she'd gotten there, how long it had been since the elevator had first started its strange descent. And as she stood there, trembling, staring down the dark hallway, Sarah knew one thing with absolute certainty: this wasn't just an old hotel. This place was haunted. And whatever had been waiting for her in the shadows had found her. The temperature had dropped noticeably as Megan stepped off the elevator, a chill sweeping through the hallway as if it were somehow insulated from the warmth of the floors below. She felt a faint tremor pass through her body, something subtle but unmistakable, like the world itself was holding its breath. The elevator had brought her to the underground level of the old mansion, a place that had long been sealed off from the rest of the building. The owner had insisted it was too dangerous to visit, but Megan had always been curious. She had heard rumors, stories about the basement, about strange occurrences, objects shifting on their own, voices echoing when no one was there. It was just old legends, she had thought. Nothing more than stories to make the place feel mysterious. But standing in the narrow hallway now, she realized there was more to it. The air was thick, heavy with dust, as though it had not been disturbed in decades. The walls, once painted a bright shade of green, were now dulled by time, the color faded and peeling in places. The floor beneath her feet creaked ominously with every step, the wooden planks groaning as if they, too, were warning her to turn back. Megan pressed forward, her heartbeat quickening with each step. She had come down here for a reason. She couldn't afford to back out now. There was something compelling her to uncover whatever secret the basement had been hiding all these years. The faint smell of mildew and decay filled the air, mingling with the bitter scent of old wood. Megan could almost taste the dust in the air, dry and musty against her tongue. She felt a sudden, inexplicable sense of dread, as if her every move was being watched, observed from the darkness. She shook her head, telling herself it was just the unease of being in an unfamiliar place, just her imagination playing tricks on her. But even as she tried to reason with herself, the sensation of being watched didn't fade. It grew stronger. She paused, glancing over her shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing behind her in the shadows. But there was nothing, only the still, oppressive silence of the basement. Her reflection in the window at the far end of the hallway seemed to twist unnaturally, just for a split second, as though it had a mind of its own. Megan's stomach churned, and she quickly turned away, trying to ignore the sudden unease settling deep within her. The hallway stretched out before her, dark and unwelcoming, with doorways leading off into rooms that Megan could only guess at. A few doors were ajar, revealing nothing but darkness beyond. Others were closed tightly, their wooden surfaces scarred and weathered, as though they had been locked for decades. Megan moved cautiously, each step slow and deliberate, her breath shallow in the stagnant air. The silence was so thick that it felt almost suffocating, as if the walls themselves were pressing in on her. She could hear nothing, no footsteps, no sounds from above, just the steady, eerie hum of the building settling in the cold night air. She could feel her heart beating in her chest, a steady drum of fear. She knew she had to keep going, but every fiber of her being was telling her to turn around, to flee back to the safety of the elevator and forget she had ever come here. But that wasn't an option. Not now. Not when she was so close. As she walked deeper into the basement, the temperature seemed to drop even further. She pulled her jacket tighter around her shoulders, shivering involuntarily. The deeper she went, the darker it became. The hallway seemed endless, stretching on far beyond what she could see. The faint, flickering light from the overhead bulb only seemed to make the shadows more pronounced, casting long, creeping figures that seemed to dance in the corners of her vision. She tried to focus on the space around her, her eyes scanning every corner, every door, but no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being followed. That something was moving just out of sight, something waiting for her to make a mistake. It was irrational, of course. She had to be imagining it. There was no one here. No one but her. The basement was empty. But the longer she stood there, the more she felt the weight of the silence pressing down on her, as though the basement itself was alive, aware of her presence, aware of the fact that she didn't belong. Her footsteps slowed as she approached one of the doors, its edges chipped and the wood weathered by years of neglect. The door was slightly ajar, just enough for her to see into the room beyond. She leaned closer, her breath catching in her throat as she peered into the darkness. For a moment, she thought she saw something move, a shadow shifting just beyond the doorway. A cold wave of fear washed over her, but she forced herself to take a breath. It was probably just a rat or some other animal. Nothing to be afraid of. Still, she hesitated. With a deep, steadying breath, Megan pushed the door open further, the sound of creaking would echoing through the hallway. Her eyes adjusted to the dim light as she stepped inside. The room was small, cluttered with old furniture that had been left to rot. Cobwebs clung to the corners, and dust covered everything. A single light bulb hung from the ceiling, its faint glow barely enough to see by. As her gaze swept the room, Megan's eyes landed on something that made her blood run cold, a large, ornate mirror leaning against the far wall. It was old, the frame tarnished with age, but it was the reflection that caught her attention. It was distorted, warped, as if something in the mirror was trying to escape. Her own reflection seemed off too. She looked different. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with a kind of terror that she couldn't quite place. The air in the room was thick, heavy with something else, something wrong. Megan felt her pulse quicken as she took a step closer to the mirror, her breath shallow. Something wasn't right here. She could feel it. And then, as if in response to her unspoken fear, the reflection in the mirror shifted. Megan froze, her heart thudding in her chest. At first, it was subtle, just a slight change, a flicker of movement, something out of place. But then it grew clearer. In the reflection, Megan saw another figure standing behind her, tall and shadowy, barely visible in the dim light. Her stomach lurched, and she spun around quickly, her breath caught in her throat. There was no one there. But when she looked back at the mirror, the figure was still there. It was closer now, its outline more distinct. The reflection of her own face twisted into an expression of terror, her eyes wide with shock as the figure in the mirror grinned, its smile far too wide, too inhuman. Megan stumbled back, her body trembling with fear. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. This couldn't be happening. This had to be some kind of trick, some reflection of her own mind playing on her fears. But then the figure in the mirror moved again. This time, it stepped closer to her reflection, its hand reaching out toward her. Megan felt a cold, suffocating wave of fear wash over her as the hand in the mirror came closer and closer, until it seemed to be right on the other side of the glass, its fingers barely an inch from her own. She turned and ran. Her footsteps echoed through the basement, the air seeming to grow heavier with each passing second. The hallway stretched on endlessly before her, the dim light of the bulb flickering as she sprinted down it, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't look back. She couldn't. But she could feel the presence behind her, the pressure of something following her, something that was just out of sight. She could hear it now, slow, deliberate footsteps following in time with hers, keeping pace. The temperature dropped even further, and her breath came out in ragged clouds, visible in the frigid air. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Megan reached the elevator again. She slammed her hand against the button, desperation clawing at her. The doors opened with a soft ding, and she stumbled inside, her body shaking. She didn't care where it took her, as long as it was away from this place. As the doors closed, she leaned against the metal wall, trying to catch her breath, her mind racing. But then, just as the elevator began its ascent, the lights flickered, and the whisper came again. So distant. Megan. It was a voice from the darkness, a voice that carried with it an unshakable promise of something waiting, something patient. Something that wouldn't let her leave. The elevator hummed quietly as the soft chime of the music echoed through the still, oppressive air. Each floor passed by in its usual monotonous pattern, the numbers above the door flickering on and off as they moved higher. For a brief moment, Noah allowed himself to close his eyes and take a deep breath. The exhaustion of the past week had begun to take its toll, and he couldn't help but feel the weight of every sleepless night pressing down on him. The tall, glass and steel building seemed endless, stretching up toward the sky, a towering giant of concrete and glass, but inside, it felt like an entirely different world, one full of cold, lifeless space that seemed to swallow him whole. The elevator stopped with a jarring lurch, and Noah's eyes snapped open, his stomach sinking as the light above him flickered, casting everything in an eerie, uneven glow. He glanced at the panel and for a moment his breath caught. The numbers above the door were frozen. The elevator had stopped. But not at his floor. It wasn't the 32nd floor, the one he needed to get to. Instead, it had paused in the middle of the building, somewhere far between floors, as if it had gotten stuck. That strange feeling of discomfort crept back up his spine, spreading through him like a poison. The soft music that had been playing in the background seemed to vanish, leaving an unnerving silence in its wake. The elevator had become an island of isolation, suspended in the middle of nowhere. Noah pressed the button for his floor, the familiar glow of the light above the panel flickering dimly before going out altogether. Panic crept up his throat like a thick fog. His fingers trembled as he pressed the button again, harder this time, but the elevator didn't respond. The stillness around him grew heavier, suffocating. He reached for his phone, but as he unlocked it, he saw that there was no signal. The small, flashing bars indicating reception were gone. The unsettling realization hit him like a hammer to the chest. He was completely cut off. No signal. No way to communicate with anyone. The weight of isolation was heavier than he had ever imagined. He slammed his palm against the panel again, desperate, but it was useless. The elevator wasn't going anywhere. The air inside the small metal box grew thicker, colder, and it wasn't just the temperature, it was something deeper, something that reached inside him, curling around his insides. His breathing became shallow, his heart rate quickening as the cold began to seep into his skin. He felt as though the elevator itself had become an entity, alive, waiting, and watching. He could almost hear it, the faint creak of metal, the groan of the cables stretching beneath him, as if the entire building was breathing, straining under the weight of something unseen. Noah clenched his fists, his knuckles turning white as he fought to keep his composure. It wasn't real. It couldn't be. He was just tired, he told himself. This building was old. Maybe the elevator was faulty. He was fine. Everything was fine. But then the lights flickered once more. This time, it wasn't just the dull, hesitant flicker of an old bulb. The lights danced wildly, as though something was short-circuiting in the very walls of the elevator. It wasn't natural. The eerie light cast long, stretched shadows against the walls of the elevator, bending and distorting the space around him. And in that distorted light, Noah thought he saw something. A figure. A shadow, creeping from one corner of the elevator and then vanishing just as quickly, like a wisp of smoke. He froze, his breath caught in his throat. It was nothing. Just a trick of the light. Just his mind playing games, as it had before. He had been working too much, his eyes strained from staring at the computer screen, sleep-deprived. There was no one in the elevator. No one but him. But then, the floor beneath him groaned. It was subtle at first, a barely audible rumble that seemed to vibrate through the steel floor of the elevator. His body tensed at the sound, a prickle of fear creeping up his back. The elevator began to shake, almost imperceptibly at first, a low shudder that rumbled through his bones. Noah gripped the handrail, trying to steady himself, but the shaking grew stronger, more pronounced. It wasn't just a malfunction. It wasn't just some mechanical error. Something was wrong. Very wrong. The temperature dropped another degree, and the smell in the air shifted, sharp and bitter, like burnt metal or scorched earth. Noah's mouth went dry as he looked around. There was no exit. There was no way out. The elevator felt like it was closing in on him, trapping him in a space that wasn't just confined by walls, but by something darker, something malevolent. The shaking stopped as suddenly as it had started, but the silence that followed was worse. It was an eerie, profound silence that filled every corner of the elevator and stretched into the dark abyss beyond the doors. Noah's heartbeat thudded in his ears, loud and rapid. His eyes darted around the elevator once more, his senses on high alert. There was nothing visible, but his skin prickled with the sense of being watched. The air was thick, too thick. It was as though something unseen was pressing down on him, trying to suffocate him from the inside out. The oppressive feeling of isolation intensified, and Noah couldn't breathe. His panic rose like a tide, pushing against his chest, tightening his throat. He couldn't stay in this elevator any longer. He had to get out. He couldn't take it. He couldn't breathe. He reached for the emergency button, his fingers trembling as he pressed it repeatedly. The light above the panel flickered again, and for a brief moment he thought he heard a voice. A low murmur, barely audible. He stopped, his hand frozen midair. The voice seemed to come from the walls of the elevator itself, like the building was whispering to him, beckoning him, urging him to stay. But it wasn't just the voice, it was the feeling that it carried with it. Something ancient. Something dark. Something that didn't belong in the world above. And then it happened. The elevator doors slid open. At first, Noah thought it was a trick of the light, that the system had somehow reset itself, but as the doors slowly creaked open, a wave of icy air rushed in, carrying with it the smell of dust and mildew. He looked out into the darkness beyond, his pulse quickening. This wasn't the lobby. This wasn't his floor. In fact, the space beyond the elevator didn't look like any part of the building he knew. The walls were cracked and peeling, the floor littered with debris, and the hallway stretched on in both directions, a long corridor of shadows. The air was thick with something foul, as if it hadn't been disturbed in decades. Noah stepped forward cautiously, his feet slow and unsure. He couldn't explain why, but his body moved of its own accord, his feet carrying him into the darkness beyond the elevator. As he stepped out, the doors of the elevator slammed shut behind him with a force that made the air vibrate. He jumped back, his heart pounding, but the door didn't open again. The elevator had vanished, leaving him standing in the eerie, empty hallway. The lights above flickered once more, casting long shadows along the walls, but this time, the shadows moved. They shifted unnaturally, stretching across the floor, the walls, as if they had a life of their own. Noah's breath hitched in his throat as he turned in every direction, the silence closing in around him like a vice. His senses screamed at him to run, to get back into the elevator and escape, but his feet refused to obey. He felt rooted to the spot, paralyzed, as if something was holding him in place, trapping him in this strange, forgotten part of the building. And then from the far end of the hallway he saw it. A figure, standing motionless in the distance, its outline barely visible in the dim light. It was tall, unnaturally tall, its body cloaked in shadow, and its face was obscured, hidden behind something black and featureless. Noah's breath caught in his throat. He could feel the presence, heavy and suffocating, pressing down on him, filling the space. The figure didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, staring at him with an intensity that sent waves of dread crashing through him. He couldn't see its eyes, but he could feel them. The weight of its gaze bore down on him, and the air grew colder still. He could hear the low hum of electricity, faint but unmistakable, as if the building itself was coming alive around him. The shadows shifted again, the walls seeming to close in. And then the figure moved. It was fast, too fast for his eyes to follow. One moment, it was standing at the end of the hallway, and the next, it was right in front of him, mere inches away. The space between them seemed to collapse, and Noah's breath caught in his throat as he tried to scream, but no sound came. The figure reached out, its hand, dark and impossibly long, reaching for him, its fingers stretching toward his throat. And everything went black. The last thing Noah felt was the chill of its touch. Cora's footsteps echoed through the dimly lit parking garage, the sound amplifying in the stillness of the early morning hours. She had stayed late at work again, just like always, poring over contracts and data until the world outside her office had gone quiet. The usual hum of the city had faded, leaving only the soft, distant sounds of traffic that seemed to come from miles away. She hadn't meant to stay so late. It was one of those days where time had slipped away without her noticing. But now, she was heading home, exhausted, frustrated, ready to get into bed and forget about the day. She could barely keep her eyes open, but the walk to her car was short, just a few hundred feet through the underground garage. The air was cool, dry with a faint metallic scent that always seemed to linger here. She reached for her keys as she approached the car, her fingers fumbling in the dark for the right one. It had been a long day, and her mind was foggy with fatigue. She just wanted to get inside and go to sleep. As she slid the key into the lock, she heard something, a sound that was out of place. A soft scrape, like something dragging across the concrete. She stopped, her breath hitching in her throat. For a moment, the world around her seemed to still. She glanced around the garage, squinting into the darkness. There was no one there. Just rows and rows of parked cars, some of them with windows slightly rolled down, some with the doors locked and silent. Cora shook her head, trying to convince herself it was nothing. The garage was old, after all. The pipes above her creaked and groaned, and the occasional car alarm would go off in the distance. It was nothing. She unlocked the door and slid into the driver's seat, pushing the discomfort to the back of her mind. As she started the engine, the rumble of the car's motor seemed almost too loud in the quiet, reverberating through the concrete walls. She could feel the vibrations under her fingers as she gripped the steering wheel, but it was oddly comforting. A sense of normalcy in a world that felt off balance. But as she began to reverse out of the space, another sound echoed through the garage, closer this time, more distinct. The scrape, followed by a low thud. Cora froze, her foot hovering over the brake. Her eyes darted to the rearview mirror, scanning the empty spaces behind her, but she saw nothing. No movement. No figure. Only the stark, dim light from the overhead fluorescents illuminating the rows of cars. The scrape sounded again, this time followed by a shuffling noise, like someone dragging their feet across the concrete. Cora's pulse quickened. She was alone. She had to be. There was no one else here. The garage was empty, and yet, something was there. She could feel it. The hair on the back of her neck stood up as a cold chill swept through the car, making her shiver involuntarily. With trembling hands, she shifted the car into park and turned off the engine. The sudden silence was deafening. The garage was vast, stretching out in all directions, and she felt like she was the only one left in the world. The scraping continued, slowly and deliberately, each movement deliberate, echoing through the silence like a threat. Her breath came faster now, shallow and rapid, as she sat frozen in the driver's seat, straining to hear through the oppressive quiet. She couldn't just sit here. She had to leave. She had to get out of the garage. But every instinct inside her screamed to stay still, to not make a sound, to listen. She didn't know why. But the feeling, the deep primal sense of danger, was overwhelming. Without thinking, she opened the car door and stepped out into the garage, the heels of her shoes clicking against the concrete with an almost absurd loudness. She paused, glancing around the empty spaces again, but there was still no one there. No movement. No sign of life. Yet the scraping continued, getting closer. It was coming from somewhere to her left, just beyond the row of parked cars. Her eyes strained against the darkness, trying to make out shapes in the shadows, but the garage was shrouded in an almost unnatural blackness. Another scrape. This time it was closer. Much closer. Her pulse raced, and she could feel the sweat forming on her palms as she took a hesitant step forward, her heart pounding in her chest. She couldn't help it, her feet moved before her mind could stop them. She was drawn to it, compelled by some invisible force to move closer. The air around her grew colder with each step, a bone-chilling cold that seemed to seep into her skin, making her shiver even though she was dressed warmly. It felt wrong. It didn't make sense. But she couldn't stop herself. The scraping sound continued, now accompanied by a faint, muffled sigh, as though someone was struggling to breathe. She took another step, her eyes wide with fear, and that's when she saw it. A figure, hunched over, dragging itself across the floor. At first, it looked like a person, but the way it moved, dragging itself along the ground with its hands, made it appear more like an animal. The figure was cloaked in shadow, its features obscured by the dim light, but Cora could see enough to make out the unnatural way it moved, the way its body twisted unnaturally as it pulled itself closer. It made no sound except for that horrible scraping, the dragging of its hands against the concrete floor. Her breath caught in her throat as her legs froze in place. She couldn't move. Couldn't tear her eyes away from the figure that was now only a few feet away. The scraping sound grew louder, more desperate, as the figure began to crawl faster. The muscles in Cora's legs screamed for her to run, to turn and flee, but she couldn't. Her feet were glued to the ground, her mind racing, paralyzed by the sight before her. The figure's hands were covered in something dark, something wet, as though it had been crawling through something far worse than dirt. And then, as if sensing her fear, it stopped. The scraping ceased, the silence heavy and suffocating as the figure looked up at her. The movement was slow, deliberate. The figure's face remained hidden in the shadows, but she could feel its eyes, its unblinking stare, the weight of its gaze pressing down on her. It didn't move. It didn't make a sound. It just stared, its breathing coming in ragged, shallow gasps. Cora's heart pounded in her chest as the silence stretched on, the tension unbearable. She could hear the sound of her own breathing, shallow and panicked, but it felt as though the figure's presence had swallowed every other sound in the garage. The air grew heavier, thicker, as if time itself had stopped. And then, as if finally deciding, the figure began to move again. It didn't stand. It didn't crawl. It simply began to drag itself forward once more, its face still hidden, but this time, it was coming toward her. Cora's body reacted before her mind could process what was happening. She turned and ran. Her heels clicked loudly against the concrete as she sprinted toward the exit, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her chest tight with panic. She could hear it behind her, the scraping sound, the shuffling of the figure's body dragging along the floor, the soft, tortured sound of its breath. It was following her, moving faster now, closer. The sound grew louder, closer with every step, and the faster she ran, the more she felt it gaining on her. The exit door loomed ahead, just a few feet away, but her legs felt like they were made of lead, each step heavier than the last. Her fingers brushed against the handle, but just as she was about to pull it open, she felt it. A cold hand brushed against her ankle. She screamed, spinning around, but there was nothing there. Nothing but the dark, empty garage, the rows of cars standing silent, their windows dark and lifeless. She turned back to the door, desperately pulling on the handle. It wouldn't budge. The door was stuck. It wouldn't open. She was trapped. The scraping sound was right behind her now. She could feel its presence, hear its ragged breathing, and the soft shuffle of its limbs dragging across the floor. The darkness pressed in, suffocating her, filling her with a primal fear she couldn't name. And then she heard it, whispered, almost inaudible but unmistakable. "Leave." The words chilled her to the bone, and she spun around, her eyes wide with terror, but there was no one there. Only the shadows. Only the scraping. It was strange how quickly the atmosphere had changed. One moment, everything was calm, and the next, there was a thick, heavy sense of dread in the air, so tangible it felt like it was suffocating her. Amelia stood at the edge of the abandoned amusement park, her breath shallow, her heart pounding. The faded, peeling signs that once advertised joy and laughter now seemed like remnants of a forgotten time, haunted echoes of something that had been lost long ago. The Ferris wheel, towering and skeletal, creaked in the wind, its metal frame groaning as if it too remembered what had been, or perhaps what should have never been. Amelia had always been drawn to this place, even as a child. The stories she had heard growing up about the old park had fascinated her, about the strange accidents, the disappearances, the whispered rumors that nothing in this place ever truly stayed quiet. But she had dismissed it all as myth, things made up to scare children and thrill seekers. Today, however, standing there alone, she could feel the weight of those stories pressing in on her, the air thick with unspoken truths. She had come here with no particular reason other than curiosity. The place had been abandoned for years, left to rot in its own sorrow, but somehow, that made it all the more intriguing. The sun was setting, casting long shadows that stretched across the broken pavement, and the light had taken on a strange, ethereal glow. The park was deathly quiet, as if the world itself was holding its breath. No birds chirped. No wind rustled through the trees. There was only a stillness, one that felt suffocating, as though the land itself was waiting for something. Amelia felt a shiver creep down her spine as she stepped forward, her sneakers scraping against the cracked concrete. The feeling of being watched was instantaneous, like eyes were on her from the moment she set foot in the park. Her stomach tightened with unease, but she brushed it off, convincing herself it was just her imagination running wild. The gates, once grand and adorned with bright colors, were now rusted and leaning, barely holding on. The broken lights on the Ferris wheel blinked sporadically, casting faint, distorted shadows over the rusted ride. It was all so still, so lifeless, yet there was a strange energy here, something that wasn't quite right. She had come looking for an adventure, but now that she was here, that adventure felt far less enticing. A small laugh escaped her lips, nervous and self-mocking. "You're just being paranoid," she told herself, shaking her head. But deep down, she knew she was lying. She could feel the pulse of something else, something ancient, under her skin.